Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart is a short story he wrote in 1843. It is written from the point of view of a man confessing to a murder he committed. He has killed an old man. The reason he did this is because the old man has one large light blue eye that makes the storyteller scared. He says, "Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so, by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever." End quote. For 7 days, the murderer goes to the old man's room every night, and he looks at him, letting a beam from his lantern shine on the old man's face. He doesn't kill him on any of these nights, because the evil eye is closed. On the 8th night, the old man wakes up. Alarmed by the loud heartbeat of the scared man the murderer thinks he hears, he attacks. After the murder, he chops the body up into smaller pieces and hides it under the floorboards of the room. When police arrive, because the neighbors heard screams, the murderer is smug and confident. But when he leads them into the old man's room, he suddenly hears the heartbeat again, thumping underneath the floorboards of the room. The murderer, thinking the police can hear the sound too, confesses to what he has done. I quote, "Villains," I shrieked, "dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here. It is the beating of his hideous heart." End quote. Hearing this story now, in 2023, the murderer seems mentally ill. He seems paranoid and delusional. No supernatural forces are at work here. In horror, of course, supernatural occurrences are often used. Poe himself has also written supernatural stories before. Possibly, the heartbeat beating against the wooden planks is the ghost of the old man, getting his revenge. Or is the explanation of mental illness more likely and just as scary? The question we ask ourselves is, can the murderer in The Telltale Heart be described as someone with paranoid delusions and auditory hallucinations? And if so, did Poe intend for this story to be interpreted that way? The first part of the question is easily answered. A heartbeat only you can hear that isn't your own can definitely qualify as an auditory hallucination, which is a noise you can hear but that isn't happening in reality. A paranoid delusion or a threat you experience that isn't actually there could definitely be being scared of a harmless, likely cataract eye on an old man. To be able to answer the second part of this question, it's important to go back to the time this story was published and find out what was known about delusions and hallucinations back then. Delusions and hallucinations can most notoriously be symptoms of schizophrenia. This was a diagnosis that could not be given back then. The first attempt at describing something like schizophrenia was made in 1887, although it was then called early dementia. Thus, Poe could not have found the word schizophrenia or a definition of it or of early dementia in a medical dictionary back in 1843. In the early 1800s, however, so-called lunatic asylums did already describe hallucination and delusions in patients. They called this dementia as well. It is very possible Poe knew of this phenomenon. 3 years after writing The Telltale Heart, he actually wrote a story set in an insane asylum, namely The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather, so perhaps the knowledge needed for this story was already there. A final argument for the assumption that Poe meant to write about a mentally ill murderer is in the text itself. Throughout the storyteller keeps trying to convince the reader that he is not crazy. He will say something like, "Ha! Would a madman have been so wise as this?" several times, usually about very strange behavior. Denial of illness often occurs in people who experience paranoid delusions and hallucinations, auditory or otherwise, as well as the complete conviction that these symptoms are really happening. So, we can conclude. It can be assumed that given the medical knowledge available at the time and the context clues Poe gives in this story, he did intend for his character to be interpreted as mentally ill, suffering from delusions and hallucinations. But, at the end of the day, every reader can choose their own interpretation of this timeless and chilling story.